Alex now. Yeah.
Thanks for the intro, Alberto. I'm here today to talk to you about semantic image search. This is something I've been doing as some personal research of mine, and I'm excited to be here this afternoon to share it with you. This is my first time through the material, so hopefully I found a good kind of maybe inductive way to share it with all of you and show some of the interesting findings I've had. So the inspiration, what kind of started this whole project of mine was as I was reading through what we call the AlexNet paper, and this is a paper by Alex Javensky, and was really instrumental in kind of the explosion of all this research into perceptual problems like computer vision. So to kind of stage the discussion or the context, there's a big contest in computer vision called ISVLRC, Image Large Scale Recognition Challenge. And the challenge is you have this data set called ImageNet, you have millions of images, and you have 1,000 classes you're supposed to predict. And the goal is to make the best model to get the best results. So up until 2012, all of this work was done using handmade features. We all know feature engineering as our work as data scientists or machine learning practitioners. Up until that point, it was a lot of hard work. The results were good. The error rate was going down every year. However, 2012, when this AlexNet paper came on the scene, it really kind of blew away the competition and brought the error rate down an order of magnitude. So I was reading this paper. It's a great paper. It's been cited thousands of times. And kind of in figure 4 here, which is kind of buried halfway through the paper, there's kind of an innocuous comment in it. And in the figure, they're describing some of the virtues of the AlexNet model. On the left, the part that's not highlighted, it shows some example images and the labels that it was classified as and showing how there's confidence scores. But the more interesting thing I found on the right, and it's highlighted here, I'll read it to you. It says 5 ILS-VRC 2010 test images in the first column. The remaining columns show the 6 training images that produce feature vectors in the last hidden layer with the smallest Euclidean distance from the feature vector in the test image. So he's basically saying, here's a test image, on the left a query, and on the right are all the images that are results of that query. And they don't really elaborate more on this idea, but I think there's two very profound things embedded in this small sentence here, in this small figure in a big paper. The first one is that you can get some type of vector representation of images from the convolutional net, from the last hidden layer, and also that it would be possible to do some type of search on the images. And as you can see from the example, this isn't just kind of naive match pixel intensity search. This is pretty sophisticated stuff. You see, for example, there's an elephant, but the results are elephants in all kinds of different orientations. So there's something a little more advanced happening. So I think there's a lot of kind of potential in this small sentence here, and I wanted to explore that a little bit more. And to kind of explore one of the biggest thing that came out of that sentence was that you can get vector representations from images, and that's through these deep convolutional architectures. And here's the actual AlexNet implementation. You could break it down into maybe 2 parts. The first part is the feature generator, and that's the convolutional architecture. And the second part is the classifier, and that's just standard deep learning, fully connected layers. The interesting part here on the left is as you go through the 5 convolutional layers sequentially, the model builds up semantic representations of the image. The first layer, let me get a pointer. The first layer builds up a very basic representation. The second layer sequentially builds on that. Third builds on that up to you to this 5th layer, which has some kind of representation of the image, some type of meaning beyond pixel intensities. And then from there, you pass it to the classifier, which will get it down to 1,000 class labels. So as you can see here, after the convolutional layers and the first fully connected layer, you have a 4,096 dimensional feature vector. So that's essentially describing what the image is in 4,096 dimensions. And we can show that there is some value there, just like the comment in the figure set from the hidden layer, if we plot them in 2 dimensions. So we projected it down into 2 dimensions using TSNE from the first fully connected layer and from the first convolutional layer to show how one doesn't have meaning, one does. As you can see the outputs from the first convolutional layer, there's a couple class labels here. This in the key, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's about 8 class labels. And as you can see, there's no way to partition them. There's no separation. But if you look at the activations from the first fully connected layer, there is some actual structure there. You could fit a classifier to that. And that's in contrast to non-convolutional methods, which are demonstrated here in A and B. and the key's covering it up now, but these are handmade features like I mentioned before the convolutional thing came onto the scene. So the power of this, the representational power of the deep convolutional architecture is the first thing we're going to use in our image search. We could take an image and we could get a vector representation of it. Once we have that, we can use some pretty powerful tools in computer science. One of them is nearest neighbor search. And that's the second thing he mentions in the comment on figure 4. So nearest neighbor search basically is you have a scatter of images, for example, here in 2 dimensions, and we want to find all the images close to this point in 2D space. It's pretty simple. We just have to iterate through all the points and find the closest one using some type of distance measure. And what I mean by semantic search too is that I don't just want to return things that are similar, for example this, things that have red colors in them, and I don't want to return identical things. I want to return, if I query for an elephant, I want all elephants. I have query for dogs, I want all species of dogs, stuff like that. So now that I have all these tools to build this semantic search engine, I have the vector representation of the images, and I have the nearest neighbor technology. I can make a theoretical implementation. So it's pretty simple. 4 steps in theory. We set up the feature generator, which is the deep convolutional network. We take the activations from the first fully connected layer, or any fully connected layer at some point, depending on the architecture. We set up some type of database to save them in. And then we index a bunch of pictures. So we need to seed our database. That's what I have illustrated here. We have some animal pictures and also a picture of a hotel room. So it could be theoretically anything. We feed those images through the feature extractor. That's the convolutional network. We get out the feature vectors, save them in a database. Details aren't important right now. And then down the road, we want to do a query. We just do one nearest neighbor. So we take the query image, pass it into the feature extractor. We get the vector in the same vector space. Then we do a distance measure. So that's one nearest neighbor. We're going to compare the vector for this image with all the images in our database. And then we'll simply just rank the results, the distance. Now, maybe you're a data scientist, you go to work doing this, the theory looks good. Maybe just to make sure everyone's thinking a little bit more, any red flags come up before we kind of implement this solution? Any kind of warnings or things from your experience that come up? Yeah, David. Yeah, we got a smart man there. Let's explore that a little bit more. So here's the results of our high-dimensional vector search engine. You know, my query is a sheep. Sure, I get some sheeps, but also I get giraffes. Why? And I get this teddy bear here. And why are some of the giraffes ranked before the sheep? You could make an argument, maybe I didn't have enough images, so maybe it would be all sheeps then giraffes, but then there's some sheep down here and some other fluffy things here. So obviously there's something wrong with our search engine, and I could show you some more examples too. I have tons of examples where the search results were almost random. They had some sense, but almost random. Now let's kind of explore a little bit more about what David was talking about. So there's essentially 2 problems, one that we already experienced and one that we haven't spoken about yet with our theoretical implementation of semantic image search. The first one is the accuracy issue. None of our search results return anything very useful. Sure, we'll get something near the query, but we'll also get other things. And that's because of high dimensionality and the cursive dimensionality. So essentially, distance measures break down in high dimensions, and we'll explore that more in a bit. And the other one is scalability. We mentioned we're doing nearest neighbor search. That's exhaustive search, and at a certain point, that's going to fail. That's going to break down. And we'll look at that in a bit more. So here's a quick exploration of the high dimensionality problem, the kind of the core of why our system's broken. And maybe to help us have a better understanding of it, I have an interesting chart here, and I have some example deep convolutional architectures on the left. So the one we're exploring right now is AlexNet. Like we mentioned, it's 4,096 dimensions. I think by any standard, that's pretty much considered very high dimensional data. Another popular one, the next generation of convolutional models is VGG. That one gets better accuracy than AlexNet, and it also produces 4,096 dimensional vectors, so very high dimensional. And then the 2 newer generation ones, they still produce very high dimensional feature vectors, although lower. So, you know, where's the threshold? What's good and bad? Maybe Inception v4, you know, it's 4 times less vectors. Maybe that's good. Well, let's kind of explore that here in this chart here, which I think is really interesting. We have 2 lines here. The blue one shows the distance from your query point and the nearest neighbor. So the example of the sheep and the closest sheep picture. The green line shows the query image and the distance to the 10th nearest neighbor. So the 10th most similar image. And the red line shows the query distance from the query image to the most opposite picture in the data set. So a sheep and maybe a giraffe, for example. Now let's explore how the distances are corrupted in high dimension. So along the x-axis, we have number of dimensions. On the y-axis, we have our distance measure. So maybe instead of pointing, I'll use the little marker here. So as you can see in low dimensions and maybe 10 dimensions, the distance measures are preserved. The distance to the two closest items are short. The distance to the 10th nearest item is further, and the distance to the furthest, most opposite image is far away. However, as you can see, as dimensionality increases, all of the distances slowly converge. So once you get up to a 1,000-dimensional data set, all of the points are just as far away. It's kind of an interesting paradox. So the point to the nearest neighbor is just as far as the point to the furthest neighbor. Yeah?
Just a short question. How do you choose the dimensions? Does it make any difference which are the first 10 dimensions that you will describe? You said you have multiple dimensions and you can, with 10 it's okay, but you have to select some of those dimensions to make the measurements, right?
Sorry, I can't hear you very well.
How do you select the dimensions? Like to make a graph, like the first 10, then the 11th, the 12th, and etc.
I'm showing all dimensions between 10 and 1,000. So all of them. Well, let's wait till the end for more of that question. So as you can see, dimensionality breaks down the search problem, the distance problem. And after about 10 dimensions, most distance measures are kind of useless. You can see they start converging. Or actually, maybe about 100 dimensions, I think I meant to say. So that could be quantified as something we know as machine learning practitioners as the curse of dimensionality. And it's what's ruining our search. The other problem is the scalability problem. If we're going to use AlexNet, we have 4,096 dimensional feature vectors. So the description of our image is 4,096 floating point numbers, 32-bit floating numbers. So there's some kind of scaling constraints with that. There's space. So each float takes 32 bits. Each image vector takes 16 kilobytes. Imagine you have a pretty big search engine with a million images in it. You've got a 16 gigabyte database. You know, that might not be a problem if you're using a proper database, but if you're trying to do maybe a naive solution and running this in memory, you're already running into scaling constraints. So you've got storage complexity there too with the high dimensional data. Now the other more sinister one, more than the storage complexity, which can be solved with a, like I mentioned here, a modern database system. The more sinister one is this nearest neighbor search complexity. So assuming we have a 1 million item data set and a lookup takes 1 millisecond, to do one query is going to take you 16 minutes. So like I said, nearest neighbor has to do exhaustive search. And it's actually worse than this. This notation is incorrect. I said it's big O of n. And I couldn't remember the Greek letter for tightening the constraint, where it's always going to go through the whole thing. It might be omega of n. So we could tighten the constraint on that. It's always going to go through the whole data set, because we have to know the distance between every point. So that's the real overhead there, is I'm doing nearest neighbor search on the whole data set. So 16 minutes if you have a 1 millisecond lookup. And you can adjust that either way, but not good characteristics there. And a few of these problems can be mitigated if you use a real database system. But let's explore a little bit more about fixing the real problem here, the high dimensionality. And maybe that'll also fix some of the scaling problems along the way. So basically, we need to reduce the search space, and we need to reduce the dimensionality. So as machine learning practitioners or data scientists, I think one of the biggest tools in our toolboxes for dimensionality reduction is PCA. But we have two constraints in this scenario. This isn't a typical, we've got a fixed data set, I'm going to train something on it. This is streaming data. So the first constraint is data is so high dimensional that it's too expensive to compute PCA, and also that we don't have access to the data all at once, as in streaming. So to highlight this is if I had a fixed data set of all my animal images, I could simply run PCA on it. I could find where the principal components lose their variance, and I could cut it off there. Maybe I'll have like a 100-dimensional data set, and the distance measures will work. However, what happens when I query a new image that's not already in that distribution? I don't know how to project that into the new dimension. So this is a streaming problem. And PCA, as I highlighted here, is data dependent. You need all your data there up front. Now, there's another dimensionality technique that's not so common. It's called random projections. And that is actually data independent. You can do this in a streaming fashion. So I thought this was pretty interesting, and we'll explore it a little bit more with some diagrams here. So imagine we have this 2D space here, and you can extend this analogy into n dimensions. It works in any amount of dimensions. And we want to not do nearest neighbor search on this because this could be millions of points. One technique is to break this down into buckets or partition it. So first, let's draw a random line, a random projection through the data. Now it's in two parts. If we knew which side our query point was on, the red-pink point, we would be able to break down the search time in half. So I drew a kind of a poorly represented tree there with ASCII symbols. Let's draw another partition through each of the current partitions. So we'll recursively partition, and we'll have 4 partitions now. You can see there's a tree structure. So if we knew where our point was in one of these 4 buckets, we could cut down our nearest neighbor search by 4. We could keep doing this ad nauseum. 6, 8. You do it one more time, we could break down our search 10 times. And we essentially have 8 buckets here. So if we could find a way to essentially find where the point would lie in these partitions, we could mitigate the need to iterate the whole data set. And that's called random projections. And how do we know, and we'll keep exploring that, but how do we know how many partitions to use? And that's defined in the Johnson-Lindenstrass lemma. It says that, I'll just read it to you, it says, a set of p points in high-dimensional space can be linearly embedded into m is greater than 12 log p dimensions without distorting the distance between any 2 points by more than a factor of 1. So we have to consider this, because in PCA we can do an analysis. We can see where the principal components drop off, and we know where a good spot is to reduce our set to. But here, using this streaming system, we don't have that heuristic. We have to actually use this lemma here. So for example, in our 1 million dimension case, it says we can safely reduce it down to 55 dimensions. So that would be essentially 5 or 6 splits, because 2 to the 5 is 32, 2 to the 6 is 64, so 55 in there. So choose somewhere in there. So for example, we did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if we did one more split on this million set data set, we'd actually have a good partitioning of the data, and we could have good search characteristics. So I kept talking to you about, if we could address the point, yeah.
Could you explain the epsilon that was in the last slide? Epsilon implies that you have a slider where you can make it more or less accurate.
Yeah, typically epsilon is some type of error or noise that's encapsulated in that variable. Yeah, there's really no way to approximate it as far as I know in this context. So it's just accounting for some noise. And
Okay.
typically it's very small. So we have this constraint. We know that we can, if we keep it greater than or equal to 12 log m, the distance between the neighbors will not be affected by more than 1 plus or minus some fraction.
But you don't know what that fraction is.
No,
But it's negligible.
nobody does. Yes, it's negligible. Yeah.
Okay.
And to go back to this example, so we want to know how to look for a point. So, we're going to query a point now in this 8 partitions, which bucket it is. How do I know what bucket it is in? We can do hashing. So, like I said, this is already kind of like a tree structure, and we can search the tree, but we can also hash it too. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to build a hashing function. We're going to take the vector, and we're going to do the dot product of the random projection, and we're going to take the sign of it. And if the sign is plus or minus, we know that it lies on the right or left side of the partition. So here's a quick example I went through. So we have 2-dimensional example, like in this picture. I make a random vector 2 dimensions. You can imagine this is the feature vector from the network. And then we make our random projections. We made 4 partitions across the search space. Then we do the dot product, and then we take the sign of the projection, and then we have here. So we could find this space, this point, this vector, in our buckets by going to the right of the first partition, to the left of the second partition, to the left of the third partition, to the right of the fourth partition. So we can walk through here. Here's one with 4 partitions. So left, right, left, right. So we know that the point will be in this spot here. So I take my query point, I'm located here, and then I know all the points in this vicinity are my neighbors. So we essentially reduced a search of n down to search of n divided by 4. And what this is a hashing function. So typically when we think of hashing functions in computer science, we want a function that will minimize collisions. However, we're doing the opposite here. We're making a hashing function that will maximize collisions. We want lots of things grouped together. And this trick allows us to do essentially what is artificial or approximate nearest neighbor search. And this kind of whole technique of using random projections and a hashing function to find your spot in the random projection is called locality sensitivity hashing. So we're exploiting locality in the n-dimensional space by using a hashing function. Now, you might ask, now looking at it, that if I do this partition here, so if I take it to the nth degree, if I have this point here in this bucket, there's actually a lot of neighbors in this bucket here that aren't going to be chosen, that are very close to it. Sure, these points are in the neighborhood, but these points are in the neighborhood too, and these points and these points. And one way to mitigate that is to do an LSH forest. So you actually do, instead of one tree here, you build another. And the lines should be different, the partitions should be different. So just kind of like the principle we use when we do kind of trees in machine learning, where we do bagging to reduce the variance, we're making multiple trees here too to reduce the variance. Now here's kind of a summary of our more intelligent implementation using the hashing technique. So we're going to use the same deep convolutional feature extractor before. However, instead we're going to use a database to store hashes instead of vectors. Then we're going to index all of the features in our database, and then we're going to do approximate nearest neighbor search using LSH. So here's a diagram of it. So we take the query vector, we take 2 hashes of it, so we have a forest of 2 trees. We store it in the dictionary, and then we look it up for a candidate. So this is our database here. So given we landed in this bucket here, we'll look up all the points there, and then we'll calculate a distance between that and the query point. Now, since we got this smarter implementation in, we're not dealing in high dimensions anymore, and we're not doing big O of n search. Let's explore some of the results from this. So here's an example of a giraffe and a zebra as the query. So as you can see in the results, first of all, they're much better, but we also get meaningful results with giraffes and queries. So the first one you see, there's a giraffe here, plenty of giraffes, giraffe, zebra. And you also get pictures of giraffes and zebras. There's a zebra there. So I'm pretty happy with that result. Let's look at some more. And also the thing I want to highlight is, just like in the AlexNet paper, where the results aren't matching simple pixel intensities, the results here are not simple pixel intensities. There's actual semantic meaning here. Like, if it was more naive, it would simply match a giraffe in the same orientation, in the same context, in the same setting. However, as you can see, there's giraffes in every different orientation and in every different setting. For example, here's a giraffe with grass in the background, here's a giraffe with dirt in the background, and here's a zebra in different orientations. So I think there's a higher level representation or semantic meaning that the neural network extracts. Here's another interesting example I did. So the first data set was, I just seeded my data set full of animal pictures. It's an animal. I needed some images from somewhere, so I found a bunch of animals. The second one here is an Amazon data set. It's a bunch of Amazon product images. And I'm not sure why I put a picture of myself into it, but I did. And here's actually very, I think, compelling results that came up. It actually found people of my same complexion, and it found masks too. So I thought that was pretty compelling results. Except this man is not my same complexion, so who knows? Maybe I can optimize. Here's another interesting result that I was pretty proud of. So I put in a query of a cat, a black and white cat, but you get cats in all kinds of various colors, varieties, and orientations. So not just matching plain pixel intensities. Here's an interesting one with a polar bear. More polar bears, different orientations. And this one was pretty interesting too. I'm not too worried about this result because I think a sheep maybe looks like a polar bear. It has some similar characteristics. It's white and fluffy and walks on 4 legs, so I don't know how much we can blame it. It's a perceptual challenge. There's no right or wrong answer. Here's a really cool one. I thought I did a grizzly bear and a polar bear came up. So that's definitely not doing naive pixel intensity matches or pixel patterns. That's definitely found some type of representation of a animal that looks like a bear on 4 legs. So I think that's pretty compelling that it picked up the polar bear. And you can see I put a notation here. So when I say 3-bit hash, that's mean I divided the search space into 3 portions. So I used 3 random projections, so it's split into 8 buckets. And VGG16 is the deep network. So there's AlexNet VGG. This one's pretty cool too. It's an orange cat in the query, and cats of all kinds of different colors showed up. And also this kind of random sheep. So I don't know if that's good or bad. It kind of looks like a little cat from far away. But yeah, that's kind of the results so far. I have more pictures. Here's the last one I'll show you. And we could talk more technical details or answer your questions if you want. This one is of a giraffe, and you get all kinds of giraffes in different orientations. I maybe already showed a giraffe example, so you're tired of that. But in kind of conclusion of future work, this was kind of a very multidisciplinary challenge. So sure, there was a lot of ML involved, but I didn't actually train a network. I was just using one kind of as an engineer, as a tool. I took a pre-trained deep convolutional network. I had to modify it a bit to get what I wanted out of the fully connected layer. But I think the big challenge here was actually the engineering, getting all these pieces together. I remember I showed you that example of the implementation. There's a few moving parts. There's databases. This is a web interface here. This was a web app. So I think a lot of the times as data science practitioners or machine learning engineers, we kind of just focus on the modeling and not really getting things into production or building products. So I thought this was a good exercise in kind of doing almost the full stack. So I was able to integrate with a database, integrate with the web service. So the TensorFlow, it was a TensorFlow model that pulled out the image vectors, and I was able to deploy that as a web service using TensorFlow serving. The front end was a Flask app. I saved the hash table in Redis, which has the native hash table data structure. And I was able to wire all that together using a Kubernetes Docker container orchestration system. So it's kind of a fully fledged app. And I was kind of, I guess, conflicted about how much I should share about the engineering side of things too. But I thought it got a little confusing, so I mostly focused on kind of the modeling and using the feature vectors along with the semantic search algorithm. But to do more future work or maybe a continuation of this, I want to research more about doing, like my second bullet point here is deploying it into Kubernetes and kind of the engineering side of data science, maybe making data science more kind of across the spectrum or disciplines, because I think a lot of us are interested in that, and deploying models and actually getting them to the user. And the other interesting thing I want to do is my first bullet point. So right now we do image-to-image search, but I think a cool thing to do would also kind of to make it, get up to par with Google image search is to be able to do text-to-image search. So and I'm willing to get input from all of you too how to do this, but my idea is you type in a text phrase and then you convert it to a point in the same high-dimensional space as the images. And then you'd be able to do image search from text and from images. So I'm pretty sure that's possible. I haven't given it too much thought yet, but I think that would be kind of, if I have more time to work on this side project, that's something I would explore to make my search engine better. But that's it for now. So thanks for coming, and if there's any questions, I can take them now too. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, feel free to ask more about the deep architecture, the machine learning side. Feel free to ask more about the engineering side. I have a lot of details on that too, like using a GPU in a Docker container. I have experience using Postgres, doing the nearest neighbor search in Postgres. So yeah, let me know what's on your mind.
Hey.